thank you ever so much to everyone who's here. And this is being recorded, so it will be accessible to people. So basically, we can make it available to people who have questions. In addition, we will keep this list, almost of people who are interested, as a mailing list for Laureate News in the context of as we build our faculty and school and sub-faculty support structures for the Laureate program. So the Laureate Fellowship is obviously one of the most prestigious fellowships available in the context of the Australian research funding landscape. It is slightly complicated and different, particularly for those of us involved in medical research because of the ARC's medical research policy. And I'm really, really very pleased that Dina and Alex Finito as current laureates, and I'm also a current laureate in the last year of my fellowship. We will do our best to basically give you thoughts and I guess insights from our own journey in the context of the scheme. I would emphasize it is a very, can you next slide please? It's a very kind of different scheme in the context of the general funding landscape. And almost everybody I know who's ever got one of these things has gone up a couple of times, once or twice, or even more. So my first piece of advice is that this is a bit of a journey for everybody, in my view, and that basically if at first it really is a case of if at first you don't succeed, then don't be afraid to try again. So next slide, please. So I thought we'd kick off by just basically giving a brief introduction to three of us. So I'll kick off. So I'm actually an X-ray crystallographer. I sort of trained in bioinformatics and X-ray crystallography, structural biology, and over the course of my tenure at Monash, I got very, very interested in a family of proteins called perforin, like pore-forming proteins. But the real point I wanted to make in the context of my Laureate, I actually built the Laureate using something really quite outside my comfort zone, which was essentially a different type of electron microscopy called tomography as applied to Drosophila embryonic patterning. So neither areas of which I'm particularly renowned in, but was a sort of a logical step outside the or building upon the current research direction that I developed at a time. Dina, over to you.
Thanks, James. And I'm trying to remember what I had in this summary that is on the website of the ARC. So hi, everyone. I'm Dina Liris. I'm in the Biomedicine Discovery Institute in the Department of Microbiology. So my expertise is really, I'm a microbiologist. So my expertise is really around microbiology and microbial genetics. And so building this project that I did for the Laureate was, again, outside of my comfort zone, and this will be a common theme for all of us, I believe. I was interested, I'm interested in gut microbes, but what my Laureate was really about was to understand these microbes in the context of the gut environment and how they grow and adapt to being in the gut environment, which is a very hostile environment. We do a lot of our studies on microbes in using in vitro systems in the lab, and they don't really represent what's going on in an environment like the gut. And so there's a reason why this hasn't been done, because it's difficult to do. And so again, moving out of our comfort zone and trying to set up a system of study that really does represent something that's quite different to what we do in the lab. This environment is a very different environment. So it required me to set up collaborations and to work across disciplines in a way that I hadn't really done before. I'd built some of it, but the Laureate is all about building more of this. And so again, outside of my comfort zone, but super interesting, super challenging, and allows me to build training opportunities for people that are working on this project. I think that's all for now, James.
Thank you so much, Dina. Alex.
God, that's a horrible photo. Hi, everyone. My name's Alex. I'm a professor in School of Psychology and Turner Institute for Brain and Mental Health, and I was successful last year. So I've just started my Laureate this year. And the basic idea behind the fellowship, I do a lot of work in brain imaging, so mainly using magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI. And we've sort of been developing over the last 20 odd years different ways of thinking about the brain as a network. And it was kind of an opportune time because we started to develop a bit of a different way of thinking about the brain. And we hadn't actually published anything in this domain yet, but we had some, we were on the verge of finalizing an initial manuscript. So we had a solid set of, I guess you could call them pilot analyses, but, certainly, it was a pretty extensive analysis that, we thought we could use to convince people that this is actually a new and exciting way to think about the brain. So I built the fellowship around that approach. So in a way, in a sense, it was a bit risky because the approach had never been published before. But again, we sort of thought, well, I weighed that up with the excitement and the sort of paradigm shifting potential that I thought I could convey in the Laureate. And yeah, so it was pitched as developing a whole new set of tools and approaches for human brain mapping and modeling.
Thank you so much, Alex. So what we thought we'd do is collectively we came up with a number of talking points that I think all three of us will address. And so basically, and then we'll go to questions and answers from the audience. And we've got, we'll leave a nice little time for questions and answers. We've got about at least 10 applicants, I think, here. So basically, we're happy to engage in these regards. Dina, transformative ideas. So the most, I guess, tell us a little bit about where the idea for your Laureate came from, in a sense, because and how it developed over the years, as it were.
Yeah, James, I think where I'd like to start is to say that I've had quite a long history working as a microbiologist. And so the ideas that came together for the Laureate really merged over a long time and came about because I had worked in a number of different areas. And so my initial interests as a postdoc, and I was a postdoc for a very long time, and so we might come to talk about career path later on, because I think that's really important to talk about in the context of Laureate fellowships. But my initial studies were around microbes, microbial genetics, understanding antimicrobial resistance, truly microbiology inspired ideas. And so I was a microbiologist through and through. But as I sort of developed my career, I started looking at things like host responses. And of course, mostly when we talk about host responses, people think about immune responses. But I started moving into other areas and understanding other aspects of host responses. And they were really around gut biology and looking at, how gut anatomy was affected by gut infections. And so I sort of moved into areas that were quite different to what I'd done before. So I moved into microbiology plus, gut and host biology. And that required working with people that actually understood those sorts of things that I didn't really understand. So I started thinking a lot about the niche of the gut because it's very different to other niches. It's chock full of microbes. They all interact with each other and they interact with the host. There's an extensive microbiome there that has an influence on how things work. The environment of the gut is a very hostile environment, and yet gut microbes survive in there. That environment, think about that environment. It serves to break down food and it's quite hostile, but microbes survive in there. Understanding how microbes survive and how they thrive in that niche and how they cause disease is what I was interested in. So this is where the ideas about the Laureate sort of merge together into this concept of how do gut microbes survive and thrive in this niche and generate the phenotypes that we see, whether they be on the host or on each other. And so that's how the ideas of the Laureate came about. I had to pull in a bunch of collaborators working on, for example, stem cells and enteric nervous system and muscle layers and things that I just didn't know anything about. And so all of these concepts are pulled together with the microbiology of the gut. And so it's quite different to what I'd done before, but also I think it's really hard to find people who are doing that sort of programmatic work. And I guess that's where that idea of a program of research is what's really important in this transformative idea that you take forward in the Laureate. So it's got to be an idea that is sort of new and different and will bring new knowledge that doesn't exist, and that really there's no one out there that's doing that package of work together. Sure, there are people who are looking at microbiomes and looking at microbes and looking at how the gut functions separately. But what I've done here, which I think is a transformational idea, is bring it all together. That's my expertise, but it's also the expertise of all the collaborators that I've pulled into the project.
Thank you so much, Dina. Maybe Alex, would you like to follow up?
Sure. I think, this, I did find this a bit challenging, because, certainly the feedback I'd received from chatting to successful laureates such as James and Dina and other people around the university was that the project can't just be more of the same. It needs to be something different on a level that has the potential to create some kind of paradigm shift or, some kind of major change in the field. And that, that can be daunting and difficult to think of sometimes because we're usually so caught up in thinking about what's next. And so the way I dealt with that was to really just read the selection criteria in detail. And actually, something I do with any new funding scheme to, I guess, internalize those criteria is I'll get access to as many grants from the research office as I can and actually score those as if I was a assessor. And it just helps me get a feel for, what assessors are looking for, what narrative devices worked, what didn't work so well, things like that. And it also allowed me to think about, okay, well, how did all these successful applications pitch their ideas? What was the level? What was the scale? What was the level of detail? And then I sort of mapped out, well, okay, these are the different things I've got going at the moment. How can I bring those together into some kind of coherent vision that will address all of the selection criteria? And as I kind of mentioned earlier, for me, it was a bit of a decision between, okay, we've been developing this approach for the past 20 years. I could come up with something that would extend that or take that to the next level, or actually we've got this kind of new and exciting different way of looking at it. A little bit risky, depends on some technical ideas. I don't know how I'm going to explain that to a general audience, but, kind of also exciting at the same time. And so I decided to go for that riskier option. Not for any good reason other than I just sort of thought I can sell it better and I'm a bit excited about it. And yeah, then it was really about trying to frame it in a way that conveyed significance and scale, right? And obviously you're doing this to a panel of non-experts, people that are outside of your area, probably in many cases very far removed from your area. And so you need to be able to speak to them while also speaking to the one or two people who might have a bit of insight into your area as well. That's a hard balance to find. And again, for me, it was a matter of reading successful applications, getting a feel for how much technical detail they went into. And at this level, it's probably less than a lot of other areas. And certainly the feedback I received was that the expectation, if you're going for a Laureate, is that everyone's doing fantastic work. And so people there's a bit of a trust me there. And so really it's about trying to sell that vision. And so, I really focused on trying to convey the scale, right? So just trying to explain to people why this is important in the field, never been done before, doing something on thousands of people, developing this completely new infrastructure, things like that. And, convincing people, well, this is a very different approach to mapping the brain. These are the new things that we can learn. These are the new applications that it enables. These are the new advantages, and trying to get people excited about that. So it was really trying to develop an idea that is kind of big, exciting, is different, something that would distinguish you from the rest of the pack, something that's not just incremental. And yeah, still conveying the idea that you've got a clear plan. It's not just lots of empty waffle. That's the balance to strike. Thanks,
Alex. So I totally agree with everything that's been said. There's two key things from my perspective about this scheme. First of all, and it doesn't really necessarily relate to this particular slide, but first of all, remember the scoring matrix, really read the guidelines for this scheme. And every single section has a number of subsections that they expect you to address, and you need to address each one. And I find it very helpful to basically essentially ensure that you've got a document with each point in it, and you address each point such that throughout the application, you genuinely have got the balance right in the context of addressing what the panel score. The second key thing, and Alex in particular commented on this, was simplicity. You will be really lucky if there's one person on the scientific advisory committee that actually is in your area. There'll probably be a couple of biologists, but they might know nothing about your particular field. So it has to be accessible and easy to understand. And for that reason, I suggest that you ensure that your application is read by people from other disciplines. So engineering or arts, as disciplines in particular, you need to remember that the ARC is a very, very broad church, and that they typically think of biologists as people who have access to the NHMRC. So I think that we have to work pretty hard sometimes to convince the other disciplines that we're not moonlighting into and taking funding away from areas which can't access the NHMRC. So basically, for that reason, your application must be accessible and simple, and really basically appeal to a wide audience. The other thing I think, which was very relevant in the context of my application, which is what Dina commented on, is when you move outside your field, you need to access expertise that isn't present in your lab through excellent collaborations. And so it is worthwhile ensuring that those collaborations are founded in more than just thin air, and that there are some runs on the board, as it were. But it's very, very clear that you still have the expertise to provide the leadership of the project with involvement of key collaborators. So I think that basically the collaboration and different engagement of different fields where relevant is really, really important, and can really make an application very different and beyond the incremental. Put simply, if it's more of the same and it's regarded as incremental advances, or indeed even great advances, but more of the same type of stuff that you're already doing, my feeling is that those applications are not looked on favorably. So basically, it is about ensuring that what you're doing is genuinely something which is has got that scale and magnificence in the context of gaining not or the potential to really transform how we think about a particular field. I think that's enough on that. Next slide, please. Legacy. So this is indisputably very important for both laureates and for centres. So Dina, tell us about how you presented your capacity to leave a legacy.
So I'll just give this comment now because I think it might be useful to hear this at this point. I think I'll come to legacy in a second, but just to come back to how the laureate is scored. So we're going to talk a lot about project today, but actually the project quality and the innovation is worth 25% of your final score. 40% of the score goes to capability. And I think capability goes to legacy as well. So that's really important. It's really important to understand how this thing is scored, because we spend so much time thinking about the project and the innovation, and we forget all the other bits and pieces that actually add to these scores. So capability is 40%. Benefit is 10%. I don't think these numbers have changed. And then mentoring and capacity building is worth 25%. And I think that capacity building and that mentoring is part of the enduring legacy. But actually all of those things feed into legacy. So you sort of need to talk about that throughout the application. So I sort of looked at legacy in a number of different ways. And I thought, you know, building, one thing that I talked about in the application a lot was building this platform of work that hadn't been done before. So the work is one part of it. What you're building, all the capacity that you're building in the work, all the collaborations that you're building, that is there to leave a legacy, because those things didn't exist before you set them up as part of this laureate funding. So I think that's really important, showing how they would endure and how they could they'd remain after the laureate was completed. Really is about building knowledge and building collaborations that will endure beyond the laureate. I think a really important part of the laureate is in training of others, and in training them to be able to break away and to keep going with the legacy of the project. So training people in a way that currently doesn't exist. So training them with the collaborators, training them to do work that currently can't be done, you know, collaborative, cross-disciplinary work, that leaves the legacy, because those people will endure in the system and will continue that sort of work. So those cross-training opportunities leave a legacy. And, you know, when I wrote my application, I built that legacy into every single pillar of the work. So I had sort of 3 major pillars of the work, and I described how I would build legacy through those pillars, mostly by, you know, the work that we were doing and then the training of others. So within those pillars of work, I described how people would cross-train each other. So the postdocs that would be on the project would train the other postdocs, and the students that came in different years of the project would be trained by the postdocs, but also by each other. And that leaves a legacy. So I built that legacy into the project really through the work that we were doing, the interdisciplinary work that we're doing, I should say, because it's only 1 year in, but through the training of others. I think that's a really important thing to build in, and it counts for quite a lot of the score of the application. And so it's really important to get that right, that training. That's the legacy, really. We leave the legacy of the work and it continuing through the people that we train.
Dina, could you comment on the laureate postdoctoral fellowships, because they are a special part of this scheme, and the ARC do actually really, you know, value them. How did you marry in the laureate postdoctoral fellowships?
These are the ones that are funded through the laureate that you're talking about. So I did that. I mean, I set this up very carefully because you've got to ensure that you're providing opportunity for those people, which is beyond the sort of opportunity they might get, for example, on a DP or on an ideas grant for that matter. And so really, I set them up to be the experts in the particular pillar of work, whether that was, I had a number of different pillars of work in that, whatever that pillar was, they would be the experts. And I think one of the really important things here is that a laureate, you have to think quite differently in a laureate. I think you can't, this is going to sound really strange, but you can't be the expert of everything. You just don't have time. And so this is where the postdocs become the experts of a particular pillar of work. And you sort of have to have that ability to let that go to them. And they will become the experts of that. And then they will train the students. So how did I set that up? For each, I have 3 postdocs on the Laureate, and for each one, they each get 2 PhD students, one in year 1, one in year 2. And so they have their own little mini group within the Laureate, and they become the experts in that area. And then they have their students working with them. And of course, we bring in honours students and the other students. And so they have a little hub that they look after. And so that's what they can take forward.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dina. Alex?
Yeah, again, the legacy thing was something that I struggled with a little bit. It's not something we're used to thinking about. And, I think for me, the challenge was, how do you do something that distinguishes you from everyone else? So I guess the legacy is to a large part about not only what you do scientifically, but also the capacity that you leave behind. And so, as Dina said, a big part of that will be the people. And so I kind of had a similar strategy to hers, where my research program had different pillars, and the idea was that there would be a postdoc assigned to each, and they would kind of develop these subfields. And, then of course, you can write about how you're going to train them to do this, and that's all going to be great. A lot of other people are probably going to do something similar. And the question is, what do you do to distinguish yourself from that? And so looking at some of the successful applications, I noticed that each of them had something kind of interesting or innovative on that front. And that could have been, something that had some kind of industry collaboration or some community-facing project or center. So I think it was, for example, Jamie Ross-John developed almost like a museum for people with sensory impairments, where they can explore scientific things, for people who are blind or deaf, and they can feel molecules and things like that. And so, I started to think along those lines. Well, what are the areas of my interest? Where do my strengths lie? And so I kind of leveraged the fact that in our work, we develop a lot of open source software, and, building on this idea of legacy and mentor capacity, I sort of thought, okay, well, we're going to build an open source software that's going to facilitate mentoring between more senior researchers and junior researchers, and it will help partner people up and so on. And we kind of developed a rollout plan for that, and that's something that we're trying to get off the ground at the moment. And so, I say that just as an example for just something else other than the science that you want to have or define or propose. I think if you can do that in a sensible, feasible, and interesting way, will just help you distinguish yourself from other people. Keep in mind that every application is going to have the generic motherhood statements about, I'm going to train the next generation of future leaders, blah, 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 blah. Right. So the question is always, how can you distinguish yourself from all of that? And that's how I tried to approach it. There was the software, then there was other software tools and some computational infrastructure that we're building. But, that was kind of the approach I took. And so it's really about trying to be as practical, concrete, and specific as possible.
I agree. I actually had it. I in mine, I basically had the usual statements about next generation, da-da-da-da-da. I'm sure we all did, but also basically I built some of the legacy points around technology platforms, particularly in the space of EM and software in the context of enabling high throughput approach or enabling the throughput which would allow questions to be asked at another scale. So basically think about legacy. In my view is to think about legacy in the context of, you know, if you're working in a particular area that's going to be useful to many, how can you enable others to access that area? And I think that's really, you know, key in the context of, well, you know, the transformative ability to demonstrate that your project is transformative. If this area is going to be critical across multiple different disciplines, in the life sciences, or indeed across other fields of science, then how can you actually structure it so that other people can basically gain access to it? Next slide, please. I mean, I think we've covered this already in terms of comfort zone. Dean or Alex, is there anything you'd like to add to what we've already said?
Not really. I think a laureate that needs to put you out of your comfort zone, though. It needs to be bigger than what you've done before. So don't be fearful of that. But it has to be realistic as well. And so this is where that, you know, that 40% score of capability comes in, because that's those statements that you make in your capability really talk to whether you can achieve that thing that's outside of your comfort zone.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a degree of serendipity here. You know, I mean, for example, my own experience was that it coincided with, you know, an international revolution in electron microscopy in the context of the resolution that people could work at, that sort of brought it into the interest zone of structural biology. And so I think, you know, in a sense, you can think about this as well. You know, where are the really, you know, hot developments in a particular field happening? They might not necessarily be directly applicable to, you know, at the present time applicable to your particular area of interest, but can you think of a way of making it applicable? So, for example, something in, you know, some disparate area of you know, microfluidics, for example, could have an enormous, if applied correctly, could have an enormous impact on, for example, you know, basic, you know, or your ability to analyze a very large population of cells. And we see that with things like, you know, the Barclay Lights antibody machinery, and so on and so forth. So sometimes it is connecting across quite sort of disparate zones in order to basically make that story. Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what everyone said. I think I guess it's just a balance, and you know, I mean, I can just sort of relate my own anxiety or insecurity in putting the application together. You know, ARC does like to have a lot of industry engagement, and I don't know, from memory, maybe there was something in the criteria that industry was an example of that. And looking at all the successful applications, I'd seen, you know, there was often a big industry component, and that's something that I don't have any record in. And so I sort of struggled a little bit. I thought, oh God, what am I going to do here? Now, you know, you could say, okay, well, you got to go out of your comfort zone and build some industry link. I mean, that might be the case in some cases, but for me, it just felt a bit like putting a square peg in a round hole. And I thought, okay, well, we do have this track record in publishing open source software that gets used quite a lot. And so I kind of turned it around to say, look, instead of commercializing the things that we develop open source software because we try to maximize impact. And so, you know, that kind of turned, I guess, a bit of a weakness into a strength. And so I think as you kind of negotiate this question of how far outside of your comfort zone do you go, just, keep in mind that you don't want to stretch yourself out too far. And, sometimes, you can turn these perceived holes or weaknesses into strengths if you can reframe what you've done in a creative way.
I mean, we'll come on to this, but actually, next slide, please, I think is it. Crossing disciplines. Who'd like to kick off with crossing disciplines? Maybe, Dina, you talked about this a little. Maybe you could start.
Yeah, I guess, and just to touch on Alex's point about industry, I had worked with industry, and so I did have those sorts of links. Look, some of it was just sort of fee-for-service type stuff, but it still allowed me to talk about that opportunity to work with partners that weren't our usual academic partners. And so, finding a way to talk about these things, even when you think, oh, that's just sort of boring stuff, it actually is a track record score. And so you find a way to talk about it. Crossing disciplines is always difficult. I think it's critical for a Laureate fellowship. But I also thought about this in a slightly different way. And it was really about, who do I want to work with? What's the sort of work that I really want to achieve, and who do I want to work with? It's not always just about the group of eights and the usual superstars. And I know that sounds, that's not it might not be a nice thing to say, but you've really got to look outside and think, who are the best partners for this work? And they might not be the obvious partners, but don't discount them, because I think the ARC looks at things a little bit differently. You've got to think about who's reviewing your applications, who can offer your program the best opportunities for yourself and for your trainees. And so, sometimes those disciplines are outside of our normal scope. So I think it's really important to think about that. I think with, how you're going to convince the reviewers that this will work, as Alex said, it's got to be believable. It's got to be authentic. And so you've got to have some track record with some of them. You really do. Because if you show you have some track record with some of them, then when you talk about the others that you're going to work with, it's more believable because you have a track record of working with people in other disciplines. How far do you go? What does the project need? You've got to really think about, what does the project need to achieve that really big programmatic outcome that you want to get to? And that's how you choose your partners. Again, though, you've got to have some people you've got you have track record with.
So from my perspective, I was quite specific in that I wanted to employ an engineer to specifically alter the design of a microscope such to take out a particularly difficult part of a workflow in microscopy. So basically, I know nothing about engineering. I know absolutely nothing about engineering, but I had the appropriate collaborator and also the funding mechanism to basically say, right, this person will be specifically employed to insert a light microscope into an electron microscope. And that's what they did. And it worked, which is great. But if you said, is that what James Wistock would be classically known for in his track record? No, not at all. But the logic flow was there in terms of why it was needed to enable a particular flow of work that was relevant to my particular expertise. So I think it's worth sort of thinking about things like that. So again, not to be scared of or worried about that you're not a particular expert in a discipline. If you have the particular collaboration and you're also willing to invest the resources in making it work and show how you can make it work, then I think that's a way of basically saying, yeah, this is how I can genuinely, because there are very few people who are truly cross-disciplinary researchers, very, very few indeed. But that's a way of achieving it without necessarily being an expert in the two disciplines.
And James, can I just add, sorry, I forgot to add before, I think that you've got to be careful if it's a discovery program. It can't be medical. You've got to, you know, all your collaborators can't be medical people. I'll say that up front. But also I think your capability statement and your track record becomes really important here, because you can really show in your capability statement that you're capable of working across different people and different areas. So for me, it was, you know, working across various different types of industry at different levels. It was also about, I was president of the Australian Society for Microbiology for a long time. That involved working across a variety of different people in different spheres. I set up a parliamentary Friends of Microbiology group, working with members of parliament. All of those things in my track record statement, I think, showed the reviewers that I'm able to work across different areas with different groups and achieve things. And so, you know, your research plan and your collaborators in your research plan will talk about one thing, but your capability statements show what you can do and how you can work with lots of different people. So you've got to craft it very carefully. Sorry, James, I'll leave it there.
No, that's great. Alex.
Yeah, I mean, look, for me, this came a little bit more naturally because I do generally work in an interdisciplinary space. And so I built my program, you know, the pillars was essentially a different discipline. So the idea was that there's, you know, a different pillar that will be headed by a different postdoc. And, you know, it was, you know, I had like a schematic that's like literally this is physics, genetics, informatics, psychology, or something like that. And so, you know, I think that kind of just evolved naturally as part of the research project. So, yeah, in my case, it was a bit more of an easy fit.
Oh, I mean, in the regards to industry, I mean, there are industry laureates, which are a little bit different, but I certainly think that you can utilize linkages to industry in multiple ways, including in terms of capacity. So, you know, industry sometimes has transformative capacity in terms of, like, if you're working with like GlaxoSmithKline or Thermo or someone like that, they can often deliver something to the masses that you can't, whilst keeping that all important ARC medical research policy firmly at the front of mind, because the most depressing thing is having spent all the effort of basically putting one of these things together to be ruled ineligible. So, you know, that's something that one has to be really, really careful of. Next slide, please. Scale. Maybe I could kick off with scale. From my perspective, the biggest issue here, and it's something that one also encounters with centers of excellence, is that the scale of biology is enormous. It's absolutely enormous. You know, for example, if you speak to Dina as a microbiologist about the number of microbes in your gut, it's very, very large indeed. Number of different species of microbe or phyla of microbe. So scale actually presents a big problem. Similarly, I expect, Alex, when it comes to the scale of the human brain, again, it's a very, very large problem indeed. So we tend to be reductionist in the way that we approach these problems. But I think the most off-putting part of any large application that's designed to be transformative is where the scale becomes nitty-picky. Oh, we're just going to deal with this bit of the problem, or a little bit like, for those of you familiar with microarrays, when somebody presents this giant array of data and says, and we're going to work on protein X, Y, and Z because they happen to be the ones that I'm expert in. And immediately the criticism is, you know, you're throwing away all of this thing. So somehow, in the context of whatever you do, scale has to be basically thinkable about in the context of that you might just be using a subset of biology as an exemplar for your problem to demonstrate your approach or to solve a particular problem, but then showing how it can be applied across the breadth of biology is really important as well. So for me, for example, I was looking at just the ends of the Drosophila embryo, but the approach that basically we are taking could be used to look at any part of any biological tissue. So the scale comes from, we're using this because it's really, really good and really easy to basically troubleshoot and apply. And once perfected, we can just do it across the scale. Maybe Alex and Finito, Alex and Dina, what do you think?
Yeah, look, I agree. And there's a sort of similar strategy in mind. I think scale came across both in the range of applications and the extent of work we were doing. So I guess there's two elements, right? So I mentioned that we were trying to develop a new approach to human brain imaging or brain mapping. And so obviously you can explain that can have quite far-ranging impacts, right? There's tens of thousands of brain imaging studies published each year. If you really developed a different way of thinking about the brain, you'd have quite a wide-ranging impact, could even be translated clinically. And then it was, okay, well, how are we going to validate it? How are we going to address interesting scientific questions? So I broke it down to a series of projects, and a key aspect of scale there was the size. So at the moment in brain imaging, there are a lot of publicly available data sets that we've been collating. And so part of it was, well, we're going to be doing this in studies of tens of thousands of people. This is kind of an unprecedented scale. And again, that was tied into leveraging the massive computational infrastructure. And this, again, tied back into capacity building, that we were going to build this platform that would allow other researchers to gain access to these very large data sets in partnership with Massive. So, yeah, I think in my particular case, the scale was addressed in two fronts. One was the potential for widespread application, but also in terms of the extent or amount of validation and work we were doing within our own scientific program.
Cool. Dina, how do you scale across billions of microbes?
So I guess I think the way that I set it up is as a platform of analysis, and so we needed to have the project is around microbes in the gut, how they function structurally, what do they look like, are they different to what we see when we grow them in the lab? And so I needed to set up a platform where we could grow those microbes, where we could extract them, and we could analyze them. And so that is the platform. And that involves animals and animal work. It involves in vitro systems like organoid systems. It involves being able to pull the microbes out of that, the microbes that we want to look at, out of that complex niche of thousands of different microbes. So, we need to be able to sort those microbes out, and then we need to be able to analyze them. And so that's the platform, and it's a complicated platform. Achieving that platform is a big deal because it's really difficult to do, because the gut environment is so microbe rich, and those other microbes are a background that you need to get away from. So that's the platform, and we've set it up, and we're continuing to set up. And then we ask specific questions about those microbes. We ask questions about antimicrobial resistance and how it moves around in those microbes in the gut. We ask questions about virulence and how those microbes actually cause disease. Are they modified in the gut in a way that allows them to be more virulent than when we grow them in the lab? And actually, we think that's the case. So it sounds very medical. It's not. There's a lot of discovery in there, and all of these things apply to animals as well. And so, animal microbes are really important. How microbes function in the animal gut is really important. So a lot of it is couched in that. So that's a lot of scale there when we're trying to pull the microbes out. But I guess the application, the Laureate application, was bigger than anything I'd written before, and it had to be far more coordinated as well. And so scale comes from coordination between all of those pillars within the application. And so it's not like writing 3 DPs and mashing them together. It's much more. The crossover is much more. It's got to be much more coordinated. It's got to be a bigger picture story that you're telling, rather than a bunch of different small projects mashed together. And so that was that was quite different to anything I'd written before. And really, in doing all of this, you've got to keep telling people, where's the gap? Where's the gap? Why is this really important? Where is the gap at an international level, at a national level? Why is this different to what's been done before? And what gap are you filling? And why are you being, you know, is this really ambitious? And how is it really ambitious? And that brings scale as well. Okay.
Thank you. Adina, maybe you could also comment because some applicants I know, and I'm not sure if you did this, but some applicants also use the Georgina Sweet or Kathleen Fitzpatrick award to enhance scale. Could you comment a little bit about those two aspects of the scheme, please?
Yes, I can.
I'm not sure if this is the best section to do it.
No, I'm happy to do it because I think this is really important, actually. And I did apply for the Georgina Suite. And truthfully, I wish I didn't have to, but I felt like I had to as a woman going into the scheme, which sort of annoyed me because, you know, none of the men have to write that extra section and have to think about it that carefully. So I did apply for it. I didn't get it. I was sort of glad I didn't get it because I think it sets you up for just doing a lot more work. That you don't get a lot of money to do it. I think you get something like 20K.
And it's 20,000 a year, isn't it?
Which is not that much. If you really want to do something transformational for women in science, 20K a year is not much money. So look, it's an opportunity, but I sort of I felt like I had to write it for the application, but I wish I didn't have to. I think I did a pretty good job, but I didn't get it.
I mean, I've known, I mean, just anecdotally, I've known, for example, I think one of the laureates who went to University of Melbourne ran a fellowship scheme.
She did. Leanne Tilley ran an amazing, amazing award scheme, which was fantastic, but it was a lot of work. I guess I just sort of resented having to do that extra thing, which took me a lot of time, actually, to think about what I would do with that money and how I would use it to help people, to help women. Took a lot of effort and time, which I did resent a little bit in the end.
Fair enough. Cool. Thank you for your perspective. Any other comments on scale from anyone? No. Next slide, please. Training capacity. Again, I think the one piece of advice I can give in terms of training capacity is that if you're going to try to do anything involving schools, be very, very careful, because the education system in Australia is structured such that every state is different, and anything that impacts upon the national curriculum is incredibly complicated. And so I started with one of my laureate applications, I started sort of writing something on this, and I rapidly worked out that I was going into a very dangerous space indeed. And so I ejected out of that rapidly. So others may be much better at it, but from my perspective, and I know, for example, we have the very wonderful Marilyn Fleet, who works in early childhood education, but you really got to know your stuff for programs that involve schools and the like. Who'd like to kick off on training capacity? Alex, Dina?
Oh, I mean,
Alex.
I think probably touched on a lot of it in the other sections, but you know, again, I think the point of distinction is always how specific and concrete you are in what you're proposing, right? So again, you want to avoid reliance on generic statements about, oh, I'm going to train, you know, blah, 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 and it'll be wonderful. And so the challenge for me was thinking, okay, well, what can I do that will be something a bit distinctive? And so obviously, you know, I proposed developing this mentoring app, which the idea was that we would roll it out initially within the professional societies that I'm affiliated with, and then we would roll it out in the international societies, and then hopefully across to other disciplines. And so the idea is that it would, you know, really create this whole new capacity to allow people to get mentoring in all sorts of different domains. Another thing that I emphasized was, because my work is quite interdisciplinary and I'm going to have these fellows that are, or postdocs that are assigned to these different pillars. And, you know, we want to, I guess, change the training of neuroscientists to be more interdisciplinary, because at the moment people just come from their own specific streams. That we, you know, I would work with these postdocs to develop a set of public online materials that would allow incoming graduate students to get trained, or, you know, just know all the different things they need to know to do this kind of work. And so that's kind of what we've been developing at the moment. And so again, you know, they're very specific examples where I was able to outline a way in which it'll be rolled out, what it's going to look like. And I think it just helps show that you've thought about this to a certain level and that you have intention behind it, rather than just kind of, you know, throwing the usual generic statements at it.
Thanks, Alex. I mean, I personally utilized the platforms as part of the strategy to basically roll out training in the areas that I was developing. We have one of Monash's strengths, in my view, is the platform, our ability to access a whole variety of different research technology platforms. So, and all of them generally do run workshops around the particular type of technology that they are expert in. And I think that the platforms themselves are always very generous and open in the context of saying, well, okay, if there's something new that people want to learn and it's Monash developed, then basically we'd be happy to basically do something in that space. So consider the platforms as one avenue to basically roll out training more broadly across the nation. Dina.
Most of my training was really with the people that would go through the Laureate, you know, the PhD students and honours students that would come through, and the postdocs that would come through. So most of it was through that. But I did put in something about using my links to the Australian Society for Microbiology and building a sort of special interest group around gut microbes to pull people together and sort of to learn from each other. And I've done that. I've just done that, and we're going to start rolling out events for that. So I think what I would say, I mean, the training capacity is critical for the Laureate application, but it also, again, I keep coming back to this idea of your track record, because you've got to show that you can do this, that you've done it before, that you do it well. And so it's something that you can't fake. You've got to have shown capacity to train people before in various different ways. And I think that really has to be, it's got to be something that you really want to do, and there's got to be an authentic aspect to that. And so if you've shown that you've done it before in various different ways, it's not just about I train PhD students, it's more than that. You've got to show that in your track record, and then it becomes believable when you say, and with my Laureate, I'm going to do this. You've got track record in doing it before, whatever that it might be, and it might be various different things. And so when you say, and I'm going to do more of this in this Laureate, it's believable. So I will bring back that idea of your track record, and what you've achieved in the past is really important for what you say you're going to achieve in your application.
Absolutely. Right, next slide, please. I think that might be the end. Yes, and we're exactly on time, which is nice. And Dina and Alex, thank you so much for a really thoughtful discussion of those points. I think we've covered really the sort of spirit of the scheme. Why doesn't everyone turn their camera on and let's have questions and answers? And maybe we can go around the table actually, because there is, so everybody gets a chance to say something. So maybe I'll start top left. Lee.
Hi, I'm not actually applying this year. I was just attending to find out more about the scheme, because I have always been working on, in the last 10 years, on more medical related issues, but it has always been something in my heart to want to go back to fundamental research in the future. That's why I'm attending this, and I'm just thinking whether it's even possible to do a switch like that.
So I can address that. I think that's a really good point you've made. Firstly, absolutely fantastic in the context of these things take planning and sometimes years of planning. And I think Dina, Alex, and I know that from our discussions over a long time that we thought long and hard about, you know, I applied twice, but I'd already sort of started thinking about where it was going to come from. The good thing about the Laureate scheme is there are no limits to the number of times you can apply, unlike future fellowships. Secondly, do not be, if you look at the age or the sort of experience of the awardees, it's a sort of a double humped curve. So there's a whole subset of people who get these these fellowships when they're quite earlier in their career, and there's a whole bunch who get them very late on in their career. So basically, yes, you've got to have the track record, and yes, you've got to have the runs on the border to demonstrate that you can do what you can do, but don't be scared of applying. And sometimes it's worth just putting the thing together on paper in terms of what it might look like. And when I started doing, because I put off applying for it probably 3 years in a row, because I wasn't ready. And then suddenly I started writing it, and it all started basically, it wrote itself, because I was really excited about what I wanted to do. And it was like, suddenly it wrote itself. It was the quickest grant I've ever written. In fact, I remember talking to Luke, who's joined us down bottom here. I remember talking to Luke going, I wrote it while, you know, over a weekend, and it was like, it was just there. So, you know, don't be afraid to give it a go and see what comes out, see what comes onto paper, because sometimes you might just be surprised to go, well, hell, that sounds really great. Well, I'm just going to keep going.
Thank you.
I'm going to go across the screen. Alex, Collie.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that. That was really informative. My situation is I have a future fellowship, which is in the last year at the moment. So planning a Laureate application this year, although I just saw you're still to put the dates up, and it's a bit earlier than I thought it was. I thought it was November, but it's 10th of October, the closing. I have a question, which is about the bit we were talking about at the end, the training and capacity, and wonder if one of the panel or someone else could comment on whether it's wise to include the training of others. So apart from training scientists in our field or in a line field as part of that capacity building, also potentially training, in my case, it would be people in sort of government agencies or policy positions, and also people in the community, in order that they can sort of interact with government agencies a bit more, to sort of self-advocate a bit more. So,
Well, simply put, yes, because that's not only training, there's also a legacy. I mean, you can make a very strong legacy argument there, but I'll throw it open to the rest of the panel.
I can comment. Alex, I think yes, for sure, but it's got to be believable. So you've got to have enough in there that shows that it's not just something that you've thought off the top of your head, that you actually have a strategy and a plan, and you have links that will allow you to do that. So it's, again, you know, you've got to provide enough evidence to show that you have the capacity to do what you say you're going to do. So it doesn't mean it all has to be done or everything needs to be set up, but you've got to convince those reviewers that you can do that. And it's not just some statement that you're making off the top of your head that you know, you may not be able to achieve. How are you going to achieve it? Do you have, if you're going to link into the community, do you already have links into the community? Do you have links into government? I think that's really important to have some evidence of that.
yeah.
Alex, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that's a fantastic point, that you just want to have a clear, plausible strategy for how you're going to get it done. And yeah, it's not onerous, right? Like Dina said, you don't have to have it all in place, but just showing that you've thought about it and there's a plausible way is, you need to have that.
Elizabeth.
Yes, so I'm Elizabeth Mannius. I'm from the School of Nursing and Midwifery. I've had pretty good success in ARC discovery grants, and this has been something that's been on my mind for a while. I don't think I'll apply this year. I mean, I have got ideas stewing in my mind, and it's a matter of how to bring those ideas together, because it is very complex. And I'm in the, I'm in the medical space. I do a lot of health related research, but I do like to conceptualize my ideas more broadly, to think about the more psychosocial, cultural, and economic implications of my work. So, that does extend out to a lot of different groups. So, yeah, I don't think I'll be able to write it up in a weekend. So I think in my case, I'm going to have to think about, how do I bring together those different ideas? And yeah, this session's been really useful to help me to think about, not just think, but perhaps put some strategies in place to enable these practicalities to roll out.
Elizabeth, one thing I will say to everybody is that, feel free to send a one-pager into the faculty office. I'm very happy to read any one page, and I'm sure that my colleagues Dina and Alex will also be able to look over in particular areas. It's one page. Now, seriously, the first page is so important. Is if your message isn't across on the first page and understandable, then basically you're going to run into troubles anyway. So please send a one pager in to us, and we're really happy to read and give feedback if you so wish. So because that can really set everything up. In that first page, you've got to cover all of those areas in one hit. Everything that scores needs to be apparent in that first page to set the scene, and it needs to be understandable by somebody outside your field. So feel free if you're not sure, feel free just to write that first page, and if it flows well, who knows, page 2 might follow. Chris Greening.
I don't really have much to ask. That was a really useful session. I really appreciated the really nuanced and thoughtful insights from the panelists. I guess the main thing, for me would be definitely career timing. So I'm almost certainly going to put a future in this round. I don't think my internal thought process is quite there yet for a laureate, but also I think I'd benefit from a little bit more experience. But I guess elaborating for everyone, your point, James, and it'll be really good to get perspectives from other panel members, and ideally, Luke, if you're available, when do you think it's the best time for someone who's a little earlier in the career, I guess, in my case?
Yeah, and Luke, I'm going to just go through the other candidates on the call, potential candidates on the call, and then I'm going to switch to you to maybe make some comments from process from the MRO perspective as well. Rory Wolf.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks to all the speakers today. I've been on an information gathering exercise today. It's my first sort of exposure to the scheme. I've been applying for NHMRC investigator grants. I'm a statistician working in the School of Public Health Preventive Medicine. So I sort of straddle statistical methods on the one side and clinical research on the other. There are plenty of statisticians around the country who've been funded through ARC and through the Laureate scheme. But my question, I suppose, is how critical do you think a track record of ARC success is to sort of moving on to a Laureate fellowship?
I will make a comment here. I think it helps, not necessarily because you need to have a big track record in ARC funding, because we have international people who apply who've never seen an ARC grant in their life. But I think it helps in the context of, if you're medically orientated, understanding what the ARC sort of like, so it's absolutely not necessary. because if it was, then we wouldn't have people like Jeff Harrington, who's an international overseas applicant, won one a couple of years ago. There's lots of exemplars of people coming from overseas, but I think particularly in our discipline, it is really helpful to at least know, well, these are the pitfalls with respect to ARC applications from a medical perspective. Although, as you said, from the biostatistics perspective, there's many very great examples of people who've won in heavily around the statistical methods approach. Any other comments from Alex or Dina?
I think it can help because writing for the ARC is very different to writing for NHMRC or other funding bodies. And I know that for me, that did help. So I held DPs. I had a future fellowship from 2012 to 2016, and I got my Laureate in 2021, and it's began in 2022. And that pathway just allowed me to understand that funding system. So I think, understanding the scheme, how it works, how to write for it is really important. Having said that, the person that really helped me to write the thing was Luke McAvaney, because he really, I think every laureate would say this, every Monash laureate would say this. He has a way, he has a knack of just really listening to you and to help you, refine your thinking and how to tell your story. And I guess, that's one of the really important things that I learned in writing a laureate, which is very different to writing any other grant that I'd written before. And that was that I had to find my voice to write it. It had to be me. It had to be really authentically me, which sounds a bit woo-woo, I know that. But I went for this scheme twice. And the first time I wrote it the way I thought they wanted to hear it, right? Because I'd read a bunch of applications from people at Monash, and I thought, oh, well, this is what a laureate should sound like. But that wasn't what my laureate should sound like, because it wasn't my voice that was coming through. And when I looked back on my first version, I thought, yeah, that's not quite me, because I've written it in a way that I think they're looking, that the reviewers are looking to read it. And so it wasn't really me. And that included my track record statements and also my research project. And in some ways, I think, thank goodness it didn't get funded the first time, because that research project that I put up the first time was not what I wanted to do. I just thought it sounded flash enough for a laureate. It wasn't authentic. And so my second one, the voice that I used in describing my track record was very different to what I'd used the first time. And my description of my track record was also very different to what I did the first time. And my project was really what I wanted to do. So luckily that was the one that was funded. Sorry, I think I've gone a bit off track there, but hopefully that's useful.
Dina, that's a really, really important point, the authenticity of, and we discussed this as well. I mean, that thing that everybody has a very personal journey, and like, it's not, you can't be someone else. And sometimes, for example, if you read person X's application, you think you can be very dispiriting. You think, well, that's me. I don't have all of this stuff that this person has, but you have something different, which is equally special, so you just got to think a little bit like, well, if you read somebody with 1,000 Nature papers, then, well, you can be okay. Well, I don't have that, but you've got to really sort of think about what is it that yourself personally can bring into the system that's special to you. I think it's a really important point, Dina. Alex, anything to add?
Yeah, just look, I think if you're going for ARC, by definition, if you're getting to a laureate and you haven't pulled in ARC funding, it might look a bit like, if you've been NHMRC your whole life, medical, then you just do a quick shift. That might be perceived as a bit strange, right? But it's, I mean, in my case, I had a future fellowship and one DP, and that was the, so not like a whole ton of ARC funding. So, I think you probably just need a little bit. It's probably going to help. It's, I'd be surprised if assessors were really going in there and, you know, scrutinizing it in detail, right? But obviously, if you've gotten this far without it, I guess that might raise issues more generally about why, if this person's been funded medically all this time, why are they switching to ARC now? And you just want to be a bit sensitive about how you justify that.
Thank you.
Cool. Gary.
Yeah, this has been quite a useful session to find out from people who have actually got these grants. I put one in this year, which was nowhere near successful. When I was in Europe, I put in for an ERC advanced grant, which I got, which is probably the same sort of level as the Laureate. But what I find very difficult here is, and maybe you have some comments on this, is how much does it have to be Australia focused? Because I actually read one of the Laureate proposals and they'd mentioned the word Australia 140 times. So, you know, how much does it really have to be? How can you convince the ARC that what you're doing is sort of international rather than just Australia focused? And am I just making up that in my head, or do you really see that as something that is an issue?
So, as far as and Luke can be better to comment on this than I think there is no score that is linked to national research priorities. You have the opportunity to highlight if you're in a national research priority, and generally things that are internationally relevant are also basically relevant to Australia, and generally because of the nature of the scheme, the ARC, I think, do use international assessors in their in the process of assessing the laureates. I guess I would say that there is this sort of, you know, unwritten psychological sort of thing that Australian research likes to think that at least it will be of benefit to Australia in some way, shape or form. Maybe Luke, you could comment on this.
Yeah, thanks, James. So there's 10% on benefit, and that does pertain to Australian benefit, but it's not exclusive of the sort of broad societal benefit of doing excellent science that's internationally leading. So I suppose we are seeing a lot more applicants and a lot more funded grants in engineering, I think, for this reason, that they're pointing at usually some sort of renewable technology that they'll rehome to Australia and spin up into companies and all the rest of it. But they don't have to do that. I think you need to explain the benefit of this legacy piece for Australian science. That's the key part, I think, that makes the difference with Australian science going forward.
Cool. Adil.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Dina and Alex, do you have anything to add on Australia-centric research?
I guess it doesn't. There is that benefit statement, so it's 10% goes to benefit. So you do have to demonstrate benefit to Australia, and that is really, I mean, that's not difficult to do. I mean, I think, you know, your project, it might be an international gap that you're filling, but it brings benefit to Australia as well. And all the training that you'll do is here in Australia. And so I don't think that's a difficult one to tackle. None of it needs to be just Australia. You know, so long as it's Australia plus, that it's not a problem.
Cool. Adil.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very informative. I'm associate professor in the School of Psychology in Turner Institute, and I do very similar work to Alex. And it seems like really, seems like I need probably another 10 years before I could apply for the Laureate. I'm actually recovering from a rejection to the Future Fellowship last week, so seems like I'm on the wrong call today. But yeah, I think I will be applying, you know, if at some point, not very soon, in the next year or so, but maybe more. But I was
the first page, Adil. Write the first page.
Yeah, we'll do. And what I was wondering was, did you look at what's been funded in the last few years? Because I see, the ARC remit is pretty large, and if if someone has been funded which works in similar areas as you in past year or two, does that have a impact? That's one thing. And also if what motivated you? I mean, of course there is a prestige to this fellowship, but at some point I think it has to come from within, that you're ready. Is that how it went with you? I'm just like the process that you've already talked about it a bit as well. So just, how did you lead into this? Is also, I thought that it has to be pretty natural, rather than, at some point you say, okay, that's another grant that I want to write.
It was I'm going to be very quick because we want some time for Luke. It was the overwhelming desire to be able to do the thing that I wanted to do, which I genuinely couldn't do without the support from Laureate. There was no way we could afford to basically do it. So it was that there was something I wanted to do. I couldn't physically do it because I didn't have the money, and the Laureate provided a vehicle. Dina and Alex.
Yeah. Oh, Alex, do you want me to go first? So same. It allowed me to build a program of research that I really wanted to take forward. And I think, it was the right time in my career, and I'd built the right sorts of things to make myself competitive. For me, it was also all the other stuff that I'd done in my career. It wasn't just the research itself. I thought that I would be appropriate for the scheme because I had a very broad track record of achievement across many different areas, and I thought that would be attractive to ARC reviewers. So it was a combination of looking at my track record and thinking about, is that a track record that would sell to the ARC and to the reviewers of the ARC? And I sort of knew that it did, because I did have a future fellowship, but I'd done a lot more since my future fellowship. So I thought my track record was appropriate for the scheme, and the project that I have, the program of work that I had, was appropriate for the scheme. So it was both of those things together. Alex?
Yeah, look, in my case, Laureate wasn't even on the radar, and it was my head of school that kind of tapped me on the shoulder and said, you should think about this. And I said, no, you're not crazy. That's 10, 15 years away. But she said that, yeah, there's this perception that it goes to, the old people with the massive track records, but actually the intention is to try to fund, lab heads, but that are on an upward trajectory, and allow them to kind of go from doing good stuff to the next level. And so, I went on a bit of a process of doing some benchmarking and kind of convinced myself that maybe I would be in the running, and kind of, got into it through that route. So I think, going back to James's point, just submit a first pager. Don't underestimate where you are, or, because you think it's just for these really, end of career people. Yeah, there is an interest in trying to fund people at earlier levels.
Right, thank you. I'd like to move to Luke in the last 5 minutes to just basically give some thoughts from his perspective. Sorry, Luke, to put you on the spot.
That's okay. Thanks, James. So I suppose, look, thoroughly endorse everything that's been said today. I think it's been really great. There's a couple of things I wanted to pick up on, though. I mean, I think when I talk to people who are thinking of a Laureate Fellowship, I always ask them about their willingness to go more than once, because I think it's pretty bruising. It's a very bruising encounter. Your peer reviews will all be great because you're fantastic scientists, and the panel process is terribly bruising. So you come back with a bad score, and what do you do? And I think being willing to go again is really important when you start out. But I think it's also the most rounded sort of scheme I've seen. So outstanding scientists with track records as long as your arm, fellows of the academy, miss out every single year, and there's always something missing from their story. And I really think it is about that story, that mentorship, capacity building piece. It's not the massive track records, it's just been said, that you have to build people. You're building a team around you in more than any other grant. They are funded postdocs who are named, and you have to send a CV to the ARC later on. So it is a big deal. They want to build that whole lab. So how do you make that work? I wanted to pick up on the question of risk. So that's one that really interests me. So absolutely, there is huge risk and ambition in these projects that you've heard today. But I've also seen the bad side of risk and ambition, where people have written a project that isn't their wheelhouse in any way. The question was framed as somebody else's wheelhouse. And so I think there's this balance of how do you sell the ownership of the problem enough to convince someone who is the expert in the area that postdoc one's going to work in. So we've seen them sink on that front. So I think there's that balance of what are you an expert in that you can convince the panel talks to a huge area of science that you can impact. And this question about reading outside discipline, really important. I don't think it's realised how many people are reading this. There are 4 carriage members on panel. One of them may be a biologist. And that is ultimately really difficult to hear when you get your scores back, because they'll be up and down. But the need to read outside discipline is really key. And so if you are thinking of nominating for College of Experts, things like that, those are the sort of things you should be thinking about. I know Elizabeth and Alex are already on, but these sorts of things make all the difference to reading this range of research. Now, very different to reading a DP panel or a future panel, but still really important experience. But yes, also happy to read first pages with the gang.
Cool. Well, so we've gone, I think Greg Stewart was on, but we actually have to 2:30. So we can, is there any other questions or comments that people want to raise? I mean, I've really enjoyed hearing everybody's perspectives and hearing the questions. Is there anything we've missed? Anything that concerns you?
Can I just ask one more, James?
Yeah, sure.
The 4 reviewers, I think it's normally 4 that do the initial assessment that you respond to. How specialist are they in the area?
Well, James, do you want to take it as being on panel, eh?
The reviewers, okay, so the reviewers they select can be everything from absolute world experts in your particular field through to people who really are not particularly expert in your field, and it's a really mixed bunch. So I think that basically this is why the application has to be so accessible. So it also basically relates to, you can get some very experienced people versus some less experienced people in context of. And the other thing I would say is, we all like to joke about the compact disc containing the names of all of the people who hate you. Please exclude them from assessing this grant. But if you do have someone out there who you think really is going to give you a very bad rap, then it is worth using the request not to access if you've got a genuine reason for it. Luke, maybe you could just say how that works.
Yeah, so if there's someone you know hates you, then by all means you should exclude them. You shouldn't feel bad about it, and they'll never know. So it's just a form you put in to the research office in the first place. The only question is if that person is on the panel that's assessing you, then you have to get a justification. But it's usually a couple of weeks before close, so you have to remember it before closing time. It's a pretty painless process. Yeah, you can nominate up to 3. And the key here is, who's in the citation network of the people that hate you, and how do you pick the people to exclude if there's more than 3?
And there's multiple approaches to eliminating the haters. You can include them as a collaborator. That eliminates them as a hater, as a reviewer. And you can also basically approach them for advice with the application, giving them a summary, which generally should conflict them out of it. But it depends whether they're a frenemy or a true enemy. But, and the reason I raise it is because there have been multiple instances over the course of my career here in Australia where I have read people's reviews of very senior fellowships, and clearly someone is really, really having a go. So, do not be afraid to use that do not assess mechanism. Any other points from Dina? Anything you think we've missed, Dina?
Not really. I think the one thing I did do before I applied was I looked very carefully at who'd won them before and looked at what their track records look like. And that sort of helped me to determine whether I was ready for it. Because the truth of it is, when I went in, there were 170 applicants, 17 were funded. And so you've got to be realistic about your competitiveness and what your track record looks like. So understand the scheme, understand who's won before, understand what they're looking for. Like every scheme, really, it's not unique to Laureate, it's every scheme. But I did that. And then, you know, I learned from my first failed application to my second one, which was successful. That was really useful. That journey of learning was really useful.
Alex?
Yeah, and I mean, I just kind of had a look at some people that I knew were not really in sync with the sort of approaches we were using, and I just listed them as not to assess, and that was it. Like, yeah, didn't give it a whole lot of thought.
So yeah, so my biggest piece of advice is, if you're not sure, write the first page and really look at it and get some people's opinions on it, because that's not a big time commitment. And you know, it gives you that first sort of entry point into the scheme. And hell, you might end up putting together a grant that's more accessible, more better suited to another scheme, but you've still got that first page in front of you. Thinking about all of the things that we've covered today, particularly, you know, the tricky ones that younger people generally find difficult to make a convincing story about, is training, capacity, and scale, because they're the three things that generally people don't have track records in because they haven't been in the game for so long. So that's where you need to sort of think about outside the box in terms of, well, okay, how would I basically scale this? How could I how could I increase the impact in the context of training for this particular scheme? So that would be basically my advice. With that, please again, do encourage people in your if you've spoken to people you know thinking of applying but they couldn't come today, please do let them know that this recording, I think, will be available somewhere. Cass, is that correct?
Yes, once it's edited, we're on the intranet. We'll send out the link.
Cool. And I hang on a second, we've got some things in the chat. I hope I haven't missed stuff in the chat. Cass. The deal's already gone. Opening date 16th of August, closes 10th of October. So if you're gonna go, it's coming up in 9 days' time. Applications open. And thank you so much to Alex and Dina for your fantastic and generous contributions today. I really appreciate it, both of you. And with that, thank you. And I think we'll close.